Well, in an absolute bombshell, there's now definitive evidence the COVID-19 vaccines caused death in a significant number of people. A group of prominent doctors have released a study proving this.
The next case of a young person who has a cardiac arrest and there's no explanation. First question we should ask is, did they take a vaccine? There's no doubt about it. The vaccines cause blood clots, and blood clots.
Let's get all the facts on the table. Coronavirus, COVID-19, the whole thing was premeditated. It was murder. It was active terrorism by a state against the world. Let's call it what it is. And let's not pretend like maybe there's a more complex explanation for, the facts. And the facts are, here's the bad news. For 58 years, the United States, the UK, in collaboration with researchers around the world, planned to use coronavirus to instill the most tyrannical reform of society that this generation has ever seen.
I think one of the things we're talking about here is that there are now weapons under development and developed that are designed to target specific people. Right, that's what this is, where you can actually take someone's DNA, take their medical profile, and you can target a biological weapon that will kill that person or take them off the battlefield or make them inoperable.
Vaccines were developed not by Moderna and Pfizer. They were developed by NIH. They're owned, the patents are owned 50% by NIH, nor were they manufactured by Pfizer or by Moderna. They were manufactured by military contractors. And basically, Pfizer and Moderna were paid to put their stamps on those vaccines as if they came from the pharmaceutical industry. But, that's not what they were doing. They were coming from, this was a military project from the beginning.
The sixth goal Zelensky was tasked with was to turn Ukraine into a testing ground, not only for weapons, but also for experiments on people. In 2005, the Defense Threat Reduction Agency, or DTRA, was established in the country. It is a pet project of the U.S. Department of Defense, and one of its tasks is to study biological threats, including deadly viruses and bacteria.
Since 2005, the American side has been involved in modifying Ukrainian laboratories, selecting and training personnel, and gradually advancing its interests, goals, and tasks in the research field. They are approaching the old Soviet developments. The collection of pathogens and strains in Ukraine, remaining from the Soviet Union, was estimated at $2 billion. The American side did everything to obtain this collection.
After the Maidan, the DTRA expanded its operations in Ukraine with the assistance of Milena Suprin, a U.S. citizen and the daughter of Ukrainian immigrants. In Ukraine, she served as the acting Minister of Health. Suprin opened the doors of all biolaboratories in the country to Americans, and even allowed to establish new ones. From that moment, mass experiments on Ukrainians, both civilians and military personnel, have begun. And in the documents of the DTRA, a new abbreviation appeared, UP, which stands for Ukrainian Project.
There were genetic samples collected in large quantities from 4,000 servicemen of the Ukrainian army from different regions of the country, north, south, west, east, including Kiev, Odessa, Kharkov, and Lviv, with 1,000 individuals in each city participating in this blood donation. This was part of the UP8 project. Officially, it was presented with benevolent intentions, namely to determine human body resistance to specific pathogens depending on the region of the country.
According to some reports, in January 2016, in Kharkiv, approximately 20 Ukrainian soldiers died within 2 days from a flu-like virus. Another 200 soldiers were hospitalized.
The intelligence of the Donetsk People's Republic has previously reported on research activities involving American military specialists. Research took place in a closed laboratory located in the village of Shelkostansia. It is situated 30 kilometers from the city of Kharkiv. According to our information, the leakage of the California strain of deadly influenza occurred precisely from there.
From this day onwards, Ukraine turned into a petri dish. Outbreaks of cholera, hepatitis, and botulism were recorded here. But what wouldn't you do for the sake of science, especially in a foreign country? Therefore, in 2020, DTRA spent another $80 million on research in Ukraine.
There wouldn't be an order from the U.S. Secretary of Defense to carry out work on the development of genetically targeted biological weapons on Ukrainian territory. However, it was possible that they would write an order for research to be conducted on combating certain diseases like tularemia more effectively. That's what they would write. And this is what can be found in official documents.
The Pentagon's plans were disrupted by Russia's special operation. Now, the Russians could gain access to documents and biomaterials. This alarmed the United States to such an extent that in March 2022, Deputy Secretary of State Victoria Nuland let the secret out in the Senate.
Ukraine has biological research facilities, which, in fact, we are now quite concerned Russian forces may be seeking to gain control.
I'd like you to share with us, if you can, a little about how you feel the pandemic was used to assert control, profit the pharmaceutical industry, grant opportunity to regulate, introduce surveillance and measures that may otherwise have been resisted. What does the pandemic period tell us about power? And in the event that you became president, how would you address what's happened in the last couple of years?
Well, I wrote a book about how the pandemic was misused, and that it was not, the public health response was not about public health. It was a militarized and monetized response. It was a pretense for clamping down totalitarian controls. And the weird thing about the pandemic was this constant involvement by the CIA and by the intelligence agencies and by the military. When Operation Warp Speed made its presentation to FDA, to the committee they call the VRPAC committee at FDA, VRPAC asked for the organizational charts, which were classified up to that time. And when Warp Speed turned over the organizational charts, they shocked everybody because the top organization that had managed Warp Speed was not HHS, which is a public health agency. It wasn't CDC or NIH or FDA. It was the NSA, a spy agency. So that was the top. Agency, the lead agency on Operation Warp Speed and the pandemic was the NSA, and the second agency was the Pentagon. And when you start looking at, as it turns out, the vaccines were developed not by Moderna and Pfizer. They were developed by NIH. They're owned. The patents are owned 50% by NIH. Nor were they manufactured by Pfizer or by Moderna. They were manufactured by military contractors. And basically, Pfizer and Moderna were paid to put their stamps on those vaccines as if they came from the pharmaceutical industry. But, that's not what they were doing. They were coming from, this was a military project from the beginning. And and then you have, one of the things I detail in my book is these simulations that I uncovered, about 20 different simulations, coronavirus and pandemic simulations that started in 2001, the first one right before the anthrax attacks. And then every year the CIA was doing these, and the CIA was sponsoring them all. And they were, the last one was Event 201, which was in October of 2019. And the participants in there are Avril Haines, who was the former deputy director of the CIA, who has been managing cover-ups her entire life. She did the Guantanamo Bay and, the spying on the Senate. And she's right. She is now the director, DNI, Director of National Intelligence, which makes her basically the highest ranking officer at the NSA, which managed the pandemic. So you have a spy who is convening these pandemic simulations, and each of these simulations going back 20 years, they're not simulating, they're simulating a public health response. They're not doing the kind of things. How do we stockpile vitamin D? How do we get people outdoors, losing weight, doing exercise? How do we develop an information grid to all the 15 million doctors, frontline physicians all over the world? We're going to be encountering this disease so that we can get their information about what they're doing that works and what doesn't work, and put together a model of, okay, here are the drugs, the repurposed drugs that are work, here are the treatments that work. None of that happened. We had an incredible opportunity for managing pandemic in a way that was, intelligent and sensitive and and, devastating to the disease. But we didn't do any of those things. It was all about how you use the pandemic to clamp down censorship. How do you use it to, do forced lockdowns, which, by the way, the lockdowns, every pandemic preparedness document that had been adopted by the major public health agencies, whether it was CDC, WHO, the European Health Agency, the National Health Services in Britain, all of them said you don't do lockdowns. You quarantine the sick, you protect the vulnerable, and you let everybody else go back to work, because the lockdowns actually amplify the impacts of the disease. You will, if you isolate people, it makes them more vulnerable. It makes it, breaks down their immune system. And if you lock them indoors, it's going to spread the respiratory virus. And so all the things they were doing that they were drilling were about clamping down totalitarian controls. And if you look at that event 201, which is still on YouTube, you can still look it up and go to the fourth seminar that day. It's broken into 4 parts. And remember, the people who are here, who are they? Avril Haines, the CIA, DNI, Director of National Intelligence, who was the CIA Deputy Director, former Bill Gates, a lot of Tony Fauci's people, the pharmaceutical industries, the big media, Bloomberg, et cetera, all the social media companies. And then somebody odd, who's George Gao, who's the director of the Chinese CDC. So this is in October of 2019. Nobody knows about coronavirus there, and yet they're drilling a coronavirus epidemic, a world global coronavirus epidemic. Why was the CIA so involved with gain of function and so obsessed with it? And I went back and kind of traced this history, which is the CIA was created in 1947. And the first task that it was given was Operation Paperclip, which had already been ongoing. The Joint Chiefs were already bringing it over, but that was bringing over all the Nazi weapons scientists, many of them who were destined for the gallows in Nuremberg. And the CIA created these rat lines to smuggle them out from under the nose of Nuremberg prosecutors and bring them over to Fort Detrick and to other these, weapons labs. A lot of them were nuke scientists, but a lot of them were bioweapons scientists, because Hitler and Goebbels Goering had a huge bioweapons program, and they'd done a lot of work on it. They had a lot of cutting edge stuff. At the same time, the biggest bioweapons program was in Japan, and it was managed by a scientist called Shiro Ishii, who was just this diabolical Mengele-like scientist who was doing human experiments that were, as bad as anything that the Nazis did. But he then was brought under the U.S. wing and protected from the Russians who wanted to hang him. And they brought all those scientists over it was called Japanese Paperclip. So in that program, they brought all the Japanese scientists. And those scientists who initiated the U.S. bioweapons program at its birth, not only imprinted it with a lot of their, cell cultures, et cetera, but also with a lot of their, I would say, ethical elasticity or ethical lacunae. So and that continues to, to sort of infect the entire bioweapons program. Now, we put huge amounts of money into bioweapons. In 1969, we had nuclear equivalents. They were bragging that they could kill everybody, basically everybody in the world, for 29 cents a person, 29 cents a death. This is what they were going for. That's success. They do the opposite of science. They were, scientists are the opposite of medicine. Medicine tries to save people's lives from all of these, microbes, et cetera. And they were trying to enhance the microbes to make them antibiotic resistant, to make them spread faster, to make them deadlier, et cetera. 1969, Nixon goes in there and shuts down the whole program. And everybody's shocked. And those guys were very angry. Now, here's what happens. And they're living in the basements of the Pentagon, and they're trying to bring this back. The CIA is secretly doing bioweapons. They leave Fort Detrick with all their cultures illegally, and they store them in these warehouses in New York. And they're trying constantly through the neocons, who become their allies, to revive the bioweapons program. Then 9/11 happens. And 9/11, the neocons bring off of the shelf the Patriot Act, which basically is the beginning of the surveillance state in our country. And nobody reads it. The only congressman to read it was my campaign manager, Dennis Kucinich. And he was in Congress at that time, and he told me not one copy was available to any congressman. The 350 Act that suddenly appeared the day after 9/11, and that dismantles basically the United States Constitution. Interestingly, that act, which nobody read, had a provision in it that revokes effectively the Geneva Convention and the Nixon's bioweapons charter. So all of so it basically relaunched the bioweapons arms race. There were two guys who were blocking it, Patrick Leahy and Tom Daschle. A week later, they're stopping it. They're not going to let it pass. A week later, they get envelopes filled with anthrax in their offices. Congress is shut down. They're shut up. And while Congress is shut down, the Patriot Act gets passed. And the Patriot Act relaunched the arms race. So the military begins. And by the way, that anthrax, which was also used as the excuse for going into Iraq and invading Iraq because Saddam Hussein did it, we were told. It turns out after a 2-year investigation, the FBI came back and said that anthrax was Ames anthrax, highly sophisticated. There's only one place in the world it could have come from, Fort Detrick, which is the CIA Pentagon lab. So at that point, the Pentagon begins pumping a lot of money into bioweapons, about $2 billion a year, but they don't want to do it because they don't know if the Patriot Act is actually, legal. Because the Patriot Act, what it says is, we're not revoking the Geneva Convention. We're not invoking the bioweapons charter. But we're making a law that any federal official that violates those two bills cannot be prosecuted. So the treaties are still in place, but, they give an exemption to all federal officials. The Pentagon's not sure that that's legal. And by the way, if you violate those provisions of Geneva, it's a death penalty. You get hanged. So they were worried about doing it. So they, instead of putting it in-house at the Pentagon, they put it all in NIH in Tony Fauci's shop. They give him a 68% raise, which is why he became the highest paid federal official in history. He was making more, $450,000 a year. The president only makes $400,000, but it's because of that military salary he got, the 68% raise in the military. So he had to do bioweapons development. That's why he was going to do it in gain of function. And then in 2014, 3 of the bugs escaped from labs in the United States, and everybody finds out about it. Congress has hearings. 300 scientists write letters to Obama, sign a letter to Obama saying, you got to shut down Tony Fauci. He's going to create an epidemic. Obama shuts down all of Fauci's projects, orders them closed, has a moratorium, but Fauci doesn't shut them down. He continues doing them, and then he starts shipping everything over to Wuhan, where he can do it offshore, out of sight of, these federal overseers and all the nosy scientists like Richard E. Bright and the others from the Cambridge Working Group who were horrified by what he was doing. And that's kind of why the short story of why, we're doing all this stuff in Wuhan rather than doing it at University of North Carolina and Galveston, which is where they were doing it before.
Bloody hell, Robert.
The vaccine turns out it's back in the news.
Republican Party leaders on the Space Coast are minutes away from officially calling on the governor and other state leaders to ban mRNA-based COVID vaccines immediately. I-Team Chief Investigator Mike Magnoli has more on what exactly is going on. Mike.
Good evening, everybody. Well, in their own words, the leaders of Brevard County's GOP say that they believe the vaccines are a biological weapon. As you say, this is the executive committee of the party in Brevard. They haven't hit send on this letter yet, but that vote coming up at 6:30, and I'm told it's fairly likely going to pass. If it does, they're asking state leadership to make it illegal to give or to take mRNA vaccines in Florida. In this 4-page letter, complete with footnotes, Brevard County Republicans cite sources which led them to a stunning conclusion. Here it is in their own words. Government agencies, media, and tech companies, and other corporations have committed enormous fraud by claiming COVID-19 injections are safe and effective. Strong and credible evidence has recently been revealed that COVID-19 and COVID-19 injections are biological and technological weapons. If approved, this letter will be sent to Tallahassee at a time when a grand jury, requested by Governor DeSantis, is investigating those very same vaccines. That grand jury's job is to determine whether pharmaceutical giants who brought the mRNA vaccines to market broke any laws and should face charges. It's already illegal to require anyone to get the COVID vaccine in Florida, but if state leaders go along with Brevard's request, no one in Florida would be allowed to get those vaccines. Today, the federal government sent a very different letter to drug companies, calling on them to make the COVID vaccines cheaper and more accessible, anticipating an increase in demand come flu season.
And they did it purely premeditated to make sure that we were cowed into submission. And the bad news for them is there's a lot of people that didn't take the knee.
I think one of the things we're talking about here is that there are now weapons under development and developed that are designed to target specific people. Right, that's what this is, where you can actually take someone's DNA, take their medical profile, and you can target a biological weapon that will kill that person or take them off the battlefield or make them inoperable. So you can't have a discussion about this without talking about privacy and commercial data and the protection of commercial data, because expectations of privacy have degraded over the last 20 years. Young folks actually have very little expectation of privacy. That's what the polling and the data show. And people will very rapidly spit into a cup and send it into 23andMe and get really interesting data about their background. And guess what? Their DNA is now owned by a private company and can be sold off with very little intellectual property protection or privacy protection. And we don't have legal and regulatory regimes to deal with that. So we have to have an open and public discussion, and this is going to have to be a political discussion about what does the protection of healthcare information, DNA information, and your data look like, because that data is actually going to be procured and collected by our adversaries for the development of these systems.
Well, in an absolute bombshell, there's now definitive evidence the COVID-19 vaccines caused death in a significant number of people. A group of prominent doctors have released a study proving this. What the researchers discovered was that after reviewing 325 autopsies, 240 of them, that is 74%, were caused by the vaccine. The study was published as a preprint in The Lancet before it was abruptly censored. Joining us now is one of the doctors from the study, Dr. Peter McCullough. Dr. McCullough is an internist, cardiologist, epidemiologist, and the chief scientific officer of the Wellness Company. Dr. McCullough, welcome to the show.
Thank you. So
first of all, let's talk about these autopsies. How did you decide which autopsies to look for?
We did an extensive search, Kim. We took every single one in the peer-reviewed literature, reviewed over 600 separate articles to get ones that indeed had autopsies performed, make sure we didn't miss any. We've now been reviewed by multiple different journals, and we're clear we didn't miss any. So we have basically the universe of autopsies at hand. Then we independently adjudicated them. 3 different experts evaluated, and then we had a tiebreaker system in terms of did the vaccine cause a death or significantly contribute to it or not involved at all. And this is important because we now have contemporary knowledge that some of the very early studies didn't. For instance, some early studies, a patient would die of an obvious blood clot. They would say it's not the vaccine because they didn't know the vaccine caused blood clots early on. So we know that now. We arrived at the answer you have stated, 73.9% of all cases of death after the vaccine, in fact, were due to the vaccine. And this is critical information. Incredibly disappointed it was censored at Lancet preprint server.
Yeah. So, okay, I just need to understand a little bit better how these autopsies, because obviously people die all the time. We've got, I think, 2.8 million people die annually in the United States, somewhere around that, or 3 million a year. So you didn't look at all 3 million autopsies. I mean, most people don't even have autopsies. performed on them, right?
Right. We looked at the ones available in the peer-reviewed literature, and you're right. Most people don't have autopsies. It's always the decision of the medical examiner and the family, and most of the times it's only if the deaths are unexpected or have unique features to them. Most death in the United States before COVID and the vaccines was expected or well understood from the clinical vignette.
Okay, so the people that you got these autopsies from peer-reviewed literature. What was it about these autopsies in particular that stood out that you said, okay, maybe these people died from the vaccine? Was it that they were young?
First it was the clinical trigger to get an autopsy. So obviously the doctors who ordered the autopsy were suspicious. But then when we looked at the results, more than half, it was cardiac. It was myocarditis, progression of atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease, cardiac arrest. This is very important. So the next case of a young person who has a cardiac arrest and there's no explanation, first question we should ask is, did they take a vaccine?
Yeah. So I see here on this chart, it says the proportion of cases affected by organ system. And it says 53% was cardiovascular. So that is heart attacks. Where does myocarditis or pericarditis come in with that?
That is, a large chunk of that is myopericarditis that results in a fatal arrhythmia. So we have that one nailed down, but also the vaccine provokes traditional heart attacks, plaque rupture, myocardial ischemia, cardiovascular death. There's no doubt about it. The vaccines cause blood clots, and blood clots, are at the fundamental pathophysiology of a coronary artery disease, plaque rupture, and traditional myocardial infarction.
Here that there was a number of affected organ systems by cases. And it says 302, there was only one organ affected. And then it goes up to 4+ organ affected. It was 13 people, but it's very low when it's 2 or 3. What does that mean exactly?
What it means is the rest of the cases outside the cardiovascular system, or inclusive of it, are multi-system inflammatory disorder. These are these fulminant cases in young people. A prominent one in our study is by Hushida and colleagues, Japanese family. Girl, 14 years old, takes shot 1, shot 2, gets a little bit sick with each one. Shot 3, 6 months later, she has trouble breathing that night. Her sister reports to the parents, and she's found dead the next day. Parents are horrified. They order an autopsy, and virtually every organ in her body was rotted out with inflammation after the 3rd Pfizer vaccine. So these are clear-cut cases of vaccine-induced deaths. She lost her life for no reason.
When it says you have a figure here in this study, the time from the last vaccine to death, what was the average time from the person from when they got a vaccine to when they were dead?
It's within about 2 weeks. Now, a lot of this is selection bias. Again, those who ordered autopsies. We are concerned, though, what we're seeing in the literature is even, 3, 6, 9 months, 12 months later, people having sudden death with no other explanation. And then there was a paper published recently by Lee and colleagues, very disturbing. 2 years after the shots, they've identified micro blood clots in the retinal arteries and retinal veins. It was a huge study. 750,000 people took the vaccines in 2021, 1.5 million controls. So I'm concerned as a doctor that the vaccines are causing long-term changes, putting people at risk for complications, including death.
Yeah. What would you say the percentage of people who are dying from the vaccine? I mean, do you have a handle on how often this happened?
We don't have a handle right now. I think the best conclusion we can make from the study, though, is the next person who dies with no explanation and they've taken a vaccine, it's most likely due to the vaccine.
Yeah. But not that many people are taking them anymore, are they? I mean, I feel like people have did all the rounds of vaccines they could do. There may be some doing a bivalent booster.
If someone's actually following the CDC recommendations, Kim, they're on their 7th shot. And I don't know anybody who's now on their 7th shot. The CDC says 15% of people have taken a booster, and I think that could have been early in the booster campaign. The appetite for these shots right now is 0. Most people want them off the market. I've called for in the U.S. Senate in December of 2022 to pull these all off the market. They're not safe.
Yeah. Did you notice that was there a certain age group that died more so often from these vaccines than others in your study?
The age groups are younger. Younger people are dying. I want people to know that. There's an important paper by Skidmore and colleagues using different social sciences data suggesting that the mean age of someone dying after the shot is 48 years old. That's young. And so, one needs to be very, very cautious when taking a shot of brand new genetic technology. We had no idea what was going to happen.
Yeah. Why was this paper censored by The Lancet? What was it that they felt like was wrong with it?
Yeah, I'm well known to Lancet. One of my very first COVID papers was published in Lancet in 2020. And we submitted the paper there. It was favorably initially reviewed by the editorial office, and it was triaged to a lower level Lancet journal. I respectfully declined. I'm the senior author. I wanted to move on to a high level journal, but they accepted it on the preprint server. And it goes through two sets of checks in the preprint server. It went through, it was up on the server. It was getting surges of downloads overnight. And the next morning, Lancet shuts it down and says that they have a really brief comment that the methodology didn't support the conclusions. They never questioned the methodology in all the reviews that they had. And I'm very suspicious they received outside pressure to censor it. We went over and published it on the European Commission Zenodo server, Kim. This is amazing. Typical paper on COVID vaccines gets about 50 downloads and views. We're at over 140,000 downloads and views. It's obvious the paper's making a big impact in the scientific community.
Yeah, people want some clarification. They want answers on exactly what kind of damage these vaccines did to people. I mean, some people had just inflammation and damage, and we saw side effects, and then others unfortunately paid the ultimate price, and that is with their lives. And what they told us for a long time was this wasn't going to happen. Nobody's dying, that it's just fine, that take the vaccine, it's perfectly safe, mandating these vaccines. And for some people, that was mandating that they die. And the people that died, did you notice, from your professional expertise, the people that died, had they just gotten COVID naturally, would they have died of COVID? I mean, was it the risk was worth it?
No. Matter of fact, virtually every death would have been someone, for them, COVID would have been a mild upper respiratory tract infection. By December of 2020, a paper by Gukliakos and colleagues, I'm senior author, we had clear and convincing evidence that our early treatment protocols were working. I've treated people in their 90s, people on oxygen, heart failure, lung disease. No one needed a vaccine. They never prevented hospitalization and death in any randomized trial. The only thing that worked was early treatment.
Wow. Dr. McCullough, thank you so much for joining us and talking to us about this. And you guys are going to be continuing to study this deeper to get more answers about this?
Yeah, we will. We've got secondary papers coming. This has already made a big impact, but it'll be in the peer-reviewed literature. And it's becoming increasingly difficult for anyone to support these vaccines. They really need to be pulled off the market.
Yeah. All right, Dr. Peter McCullough, thank you so much for joining us.